dispiriting situation to observe.
Yeah, thank you. The situation here is absolutely catastrophic. It's a desperate time for children in Gaza, and we see the same as the children queuing up for food, desperately trying to get some food from the community kitchens, but the community kitchens are now having to close. The food distributions have finished, the warehouses are empty. There simply isn't enough food in Gaza for children and their families. Since the 2nd of March, there has been a stop on all food, medicines, water, shelter items. Nothing has entered Gaza in over 70 days. It's really desperate.
And are you able to get a clear picture in such a grave conflict situation of how many people are really affected? Because some obviously have fled, some are in hiding, etc. So how are you able to ascertain exactly what are the figures before you?
Well, every person in Gaza has been impacted by this war, every single person. And we see, my team, I have a large team of around 200 people. Each member of my team has lost a close family member. And the communities that we talk to, the communities that we serve, are all in suffering. We're running health clinics, nutrition points, some child protection services, some learning services for children. But what we're doing is really a drop in the ocean, considering the absolute extraordinary needs across all children in Gaza.
And just listening to that statement earlier on by the top humanitarian official at the United Nations telling the Security Council that Israeli authorities have actually seized the food aid that countries there are sending to the Gaza. Tell us a little bit more of what is happening.
Well, we know that there's thousands and thousands and thousands of trucks of food and other life-saving essentials on the wrong side of the border. Since the 2nd of March, nothing has entered. Before then, we had a pretty constant supply of food and other supplies that were coming into Gaza during that 2-month pause in hostilities. But since then, of course, it's absolutely desperate. So whatever we see here in the markets is very, very little. And also, of course, extremely expensive. And people just haven't got the cash and haven't got the money to be able to buy the items, whatever they can find in the market.
Is there anything in the markets? Because I understand that people just complaining of how dire the food insecurity is, that they're actually even forced to eat animal feed if they can even lay their hands on any consumables.
Exactly, yeah. And we've heard the same. I spoke to families this week in our clinic where a woman told me that she was having to bulk out whatever little food he had with grass, with animal fodder, bulking it out with dirty water, just so her children had the sense of being full, choosing to feed her children at night so they went to bed with a feeling of being full and hopefully slept through the night. What's in the market is very little canned food, very, very little vegetables. A kilo of tomatoes is around $10, but only if you can find it. And flour, sugar, the staples for people in Gaza are just not available anymore.
As your publication describes that this is a deliberate humanitarian catastrophe, is there any sense of what is happening to those dozens of food trucks that are parked outside of the border? I'd imagine that some of those are perishables themselves. So what is that food wastage? What is happening? Is there any idea of whether the food is being dumped elsewhere, or at least if it's being given to the people on the Israeli side of the fence?
Yeah, to be honest, I have no idea what's happening to those trucks. I know that, say, the children, we have trucks in that queue. They are not food supplies in our trucks. We've got medicine supplies. We've got kits for children, hygiene kits. We've got shelter kits. And we know what we need to do to be able to alleviate the suffering in Gaza is to get those supplies into Gaza.
And this must be causing a burden on whatever health system exists. You spoke about malnutrition. Of the 93% of people who you say are facing acute food shortages, how many of those are being treated?
We have, I'd say the children, we have nutrition points and 2 health centres. So we're seeing a steady increase now in the number of children presenting with malnutrition. We have between 2 and 3 months of nutrition commodities supplies pumping up to be able to treat children with malnutrition. But of course, the more children become malnourished, the shorter that supply is going to last us. And we're deeply, deeply concerned of running out of supplies. And again, we know how to treat malnutrition. We know how to prevent malnutrition. We just need to be allowed to do that.
And how many centres are there that are able to do that, especially as you say that the resources, the medical resources that you need are also stuck on the other side. So it seems to me like you're between a rock and a hard place, that you'd like to help, but there's nothing you can do to help.
Yeah, exactly. And again, our health clinics, we've probably got 2 months worth of supplies. We were able to stockpile or bring extra supplies in during that ceasefire period. But the cupboards are getting very, very empty, and it feels that they're getting very empty very quickly. So we will do as much as we can for as long as we can. We're running child protection services, as I said, identifying the most vulnerable children. We don't really need supplies for that. We need very qualified people, which we're lucky to have in our team, providing education and learning. You know, there's been no school, no formal education for around 18 months, and education doesn't just provide children with learning opportunities, it provides them with stability, normality, some mental health reprieve, and that's what children also need in terms of the support to alleviate their suffering.
And I'm just wondering if you're saying the number of people in the Gaza Strip, as we mentioned, the population percentage sample of 93% are in danger of facing critical risk of famine. What happens if this situation persists over the next couple of weeks? And I'm thinking particularly of political will here. That does that need to be officially declared when the situation is pretty much that?
Exactly. I mean, by the time we get to the point where a famine can be declared, it will be too late. We'll have a catastrophic situation. We're already facing nearly 500,000 people facing catastrophic hunger. It's extraordinarily challenging to operate in this environment, and to be a child, to be this vulnerable in this environment, it's unfathomable, it's unthinkable really, but children are desperately in need of support. There needs to be a change, there needs to be some reprieve for children here. We need a definitive ceasefire. That has to come. We're at a tipping point now.
And as you say that, you know, we must act now. We can't stand by while an entire population is starved in plain sight. And they're not just being starved in plain sight. They're ducking bombs and fire ammunitions and fire projectiles towards them. So just who needs to act now? Is it the United Nations Security Council? There are legal complaints before the International Court of Justice, but they are not able to achieve much.
You know, the compounding factors that are making this crisis so complex, as you said, it's an ongoing complex crisis. It's a conflict that has no rules of engagement. There are bombs dropping on hospitals, bombs dropping on schools, killing children. There are no aid supplies coming in. So a solution needs to be found. Where that solution is found, I don't know, but we need to have a definitive ceasefire to be able to save the children and alleviate the suffering for the whole of Gaza.
Well, thank you very much for your time and wishing you all the best. Certainly, my heart goes out to you, your staff members, and of course, those who are facing these atrocities. Rachel Cummings is Save the Children humanitarian director in Gaza, just speaking to us about the fact that 93%, that's 1.1 million children included, are urgently threatened by spiraling acute food insecurity in Gaza.
Mornings made better with Peter and Asanda on Rise and Shine, weekdays 6 till 9.
We continue with our coverage of recent arrests of activists and journalists in Harare during Monday's mass stay-away and protest. Dr. Tadini Masaya, who's the Secretary for the Information and Media of the United Zimbabwe Alliance, an opposition party founded in March 2022.
Every Zimbabwean is entitled to expressing themselves, whether they are ZANU-PF or they belong to any other political party or they do not. So what Geza and those that believed in his code did is within their rights. However, we also fully acknowledge that it is an internal fight, and as UZA, we did not participate in that internal fight. We are not going to be used as pawns as what happened in 2017 to usher in a different face for ZANU-PF. It does not matter who is the face of ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF is going to remain the same.
Mornings made better with Peter and Asanda on Rise and Shine. Channel Africa, born to tell Africa's incredible stories.
Sigo la bueno la África.
A nossa história contada por nós.
Happy birthday to us.
Happy birthday to you.
Listen on SABC Plus, DSTV Audio Bouquet 802, and Satellite Channel PAS 10. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective. When the sun goes down, we don't stop the talk. Channel Africa, the best nighttime radio.
At 22:30 we continue with our coverage of some of the top stories here on the continent and beyond. A new report by Amnesty International says Kenyan women hired as domestic workers in Saudi Arabia endure grueling, abusive and discriminatory working conditions, which often amount to forced labor and human trafficking. For more on this, we are now joined on the line by the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya, Irungu Houghton. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Houghton.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting us.
If you could just start with the stats or figures of how many women are known, Kenyan women are known to be part of the domestic workforce in Saudi Arabia, and if possible, to tell us how they got there.
The research that we released this week essentially captures about 4 million domestic workers work out of Saudi Arabia, and many of them are Asian and African. Of them, about 150,000 are Kenyan domestic workers, and their experiences are just horrendous.
And this report of yours, Locked In, Left Out, the hidden lives of Kenyan domestic workers in Saudi Arabia, what sparked it?
Well, in Kenya, we have, often we see lots of articles in the papers, anecdotes, stories of personal testimonies. Sadly, several cases of people being returned in caskets and returned to their families in circumstances that are just unclear. Many of them have not undergone postmortems or autopsies, and therefore the circumstances under which they've died are just really unsatisfactory in terms of information. So Amnesty International initiated this research several months ago, and we interviewed 70 domestic workers. Yesterday, I was in Mombasa, where we released the report and spoke to another 100 domestic workers about what their experiences were. And it seems like their experiences are quite similar in many ways.
And as you say, it's a form of human trafficking. So these women, when they travel to Saudi Arabia looking for work, is it as a result of advertisements? Because you say a lot of this is happening in private homes. Is it organizational in nature, as in could there be a syndicate that is actually part of this human trafficking scheme?
Yes, I mean, what we've learned from the women's testimonies is that not only is it highly, I guess it's highly distributed in the sense that there are several agencies in Nairobi and in different parts of the country where women are being duped and misled into signing agreements that are not honored by the employers that they finally end up working with. So typically what happens is a woman will reach out through word of mouth to an agent. An agent will say, sign this agreement and we will transport you. And when they get to the country, they find that actually the employer has no interest in following that agreement, but it forces them to sign another agreement. In many occasions, this agreement has a fraction of the salary that had been promised to them, and the conditions are really horrendous. I mean, we heard yesterday women talk about working 16 hours non-stop. We heard them sleeping on the floor, not being allowed to have blankets or beds even, and many of them, again, worked for very low wages, much lower than they had been promised. Their passports and their phones were seized and taken away from them. And contact with the outside world was essentially restricted dramatically. Some of them talk about sexual harassment and even rape, which is really worrying. So yesterday, as we were listening to the testimonies, we had to have psychosocial counselors available in case they were triggered by each other's stories. So it is a very worrying trend that unfortunately has gone on for much too long. You spoke about the word of human trafficking. In many ways, this is modern slavery.
I was actually thinking, as you're speaking, envisioning a very horrendous documentary brilliantly done by the BBC called, I think it's Lost in Oman, but it's of a similar practice in Oman, although in some cases women are lured there under different guises, but always under the guise of employment. And as you say, there's a great deal of sexual exploitation and physical abuse, as well as psychological abuse. And I was just thinking, as you're conducting your research, how were these women able to escape these conditions? Because as you say, their passports are taken away. They're kept under lock and key for hours on a day. And most people don't even know where they are, their loved ones.
Yeah. No, I mean, some of the testimonies we heard yesterday were just really heartbreaking in many ways. There was a lot of solidarity in the room because, of course, they all recognize each other's trauma. But, in many occasions, what they had to do was essentially wait until the employee had left the house, break out of the house, and look for support to be able to get to the Kenyan embassy or to a friendly home and try and find a way back to the country. We did speak to the government of Kenya last week. We had a pre-launch conversation with them, and we impressed upon them the importance of ensuring that there are helplines, safe houses, and a decentralization of the Riyadh embassy. So we only have one office in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and we really need to see, different consular offices, or at least consular contact points, so that people don't have to travel several hours to the capital in order to get support. But it is terrible listening to their cases and how they've had to come back to the country, in many cases with no opportunity for compensation or even justice.
I see your report tells of a really devastating story of a woman who ran away to escape an abusive husband, only to be faced with multiple counts of rapes by the male employer. Now, a lot of these, your report says, are also racially motivated. Are authorities in Saudi Arabia not unaware of the volumes of black women, either from Kenya or other African countries, and even some you say who are Asian, who are coming into the country under the guise of seeking employment? Are they not keeping tabs on what is happening?
No, I mean, it would be incomprehensible that the Saudi government didn't know that they had large, 4 million domestic workers coming into the country. It is a country that struggles with, unskilled and domestic labor, and therefore positions itself really for Asian African migrants to come in and support their economy. So they must know that this is happening. There has been a lot of pressure internationally by Amnesty, Migrants International and various other organizations, and that has led to reform of a system they call the kafala system. The kafala system essentially is set up to facilitate the migrant workers who are assigned to families or to households to support them. And one of the concerns that we've had is that that kafala system, despite the improvements over the last couple of years, really does sit outside the labor laws of the Saudi kingdom. And our argument has been, if these are human beings, why aren't they treated to the same human rights that Saudis are accorded under the labor laws? And why is there this second class labor system that essentially leaves, hundreds of thousands of women at the mercy of the violence of an employer, or even the disrespect and undignified labor that they experience.
And as you say, the kafala system itself fosters exploitation and perpetuates systemic racism. So how can it be dismantled? How can Saudi authorities be held to account, particularly for human rights abuses at an international level?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, documenting it like this, raising the conversation with governments in Asia and Africa, and essentially pushing them to demand better conditions within the bilateral agreements. Kenya has signed recently a bilateral agreement with the Saudi Arabian kingdom, but unfortunately it's not made public. So one of the demands that's in our report is that the agreement be made public so that we can look at the extent to which they have discussed the treatment of our migrant workers. The other thing I think that's really important is to bring a spotlight, particularly through the United Nations and the international community, that if Saudi Arabia is to, for example, position itself as a destination for international conferences or sports, events, then it has to operate under international humanitarian and in human rights law. But I think the bigger argument for the Saudi kingdom essentially is that, the more that these cases of racism, slavery, and essentially human trafficking are exposed, the less people will want to come and work in their kingdom. So it is in their strategic interest, long term, to raise the conditions so that they are able to attract labor to come and work in their economy.
Actually, beyond even wanting to work in Saudi Arabia, even for tourism, one even fears being caught there. Whether you are legitimately there with a working passport, one actually fears being kidnapped and being in such enforced labor.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the other thing that I think for many of us is that, traveling to Saudi Arabia for, tourism, as you say, or for leisure, really feels very uncomfortable given what we know about the kafala system and the extent to which there is an ugliness in that society that we really shouldn't be supporting in any way. So I think, the potential for people to look for other locations and not invest in, Saudi Arabia from a tourism or from a conference organizing perspective is very high. So we do hope that the recommendations that we're making will be listened to, but I think it will need a great deal of public pressure, international public pressure, for this to happen.
Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing such invaluable information with our listeners, our viewers. Irungu Houghton is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya, just speaking to us about that report that they have released on the plight of particularly African Kenyan women who found themselves in abusive working conditions, discriminatory and exploitative forced labor there in Saudi Arabia. Brings the time to 26 minutes to 10.
Hey there, this is Palisa Tau, part of the dynamic duo that gives you On the Move right here on Channel Africa from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Africa time. Well, it's with your help for the past 2 years that we have been a multi-award winning show.
Finally, yeah, we're keeping it on the move in 2025. And yes, I'm the other half of the duo, Benjamin Mushatama, and we're going to keep you going with the great conversations. Turn it up.
Okay. On the Move comes back in 2025 to give you more of the content that made us a Maldo and to deliver that bold, boundary-pushing content that you love. And of course, giving you a ride through the 3 hours of news, views, and entertainment.
Every weekday from 9 to midday Central African Time, right here on Channel Africa. The African Perspective.
Cool.
Let's go.
Este é o Caleidoscópio de Canal África, com Remo Samo e João Yabalá.
O surto da cólera em Angola tem causado grande preocupação, afetando já mais de metade das províncias do país. Simultaneamente, a Agência dos Estados Unidos para o Desenvolvimento Internacional, USAID, um dos maiores doadores mundiais de assistência humanitária, decidiu não priorizar os países com maior incidência de malária. Para discutirmos as causas do alastramento da cólera em Angola e os impactos dessa decisão da USAID, convidamos o Dr. Jeremias Agostinho, médico e mestre em saúde pública, para partilhar a sua visão sobre o tema.
A doença, nesse momento, representa o maior risco de saúde pública que nós temos. Nos últimos anos, a nossa preocupação esteve sempre centrada com os casos de malária, os casos de tuberculose e também de infecção por VIH-Sida. A forma como, em pouco menos de 2 meses, os casos de cólera vêm aumentando, acaba por representar, nessa altura, um dos maiores desafios que o país tem. É expectável que, nesta fase, o número de casos venha a aumentar.
De segunda a sexta-feira, das 20 às 21 horas locais, este é o Caleidoscópio de Canal África.
At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sipiso Magweta.
Channel Africa.
And it is 24 minutes to 10. We tell you about a report saying that testing and monitoring of HIV patients in South Africa has fallen since the United States cut aid that funded health workers and clinics, with pregnant women, infants, youth the most affected from this. So previously, unpublished government data, that's what the source of the information is. South Africa has the world's highest burden of HIV, with about 8 million people, 1 in 5 adults living with the virus. To tell us a little bit more about this is the author of the article at Reuters, Nelly Payton, who joins us now. Nelly, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So, not to put you on the spot, but it says, your report says, as a previously unpublished government data, and we of course did speak to the National Health Laboratory Service, so we reached out to them to get their comment on this, and their response was that, well, we don't know anything about that, we're still investigating.
So it is data from the National Health Laboratory Service, which is national lab data. It's not normally made public, and I had a trusted source who was able to share it with me. So that's how I got this story. The data shows a drop in viral load testing, which, just to clarify, it's not testing to see if people have HIV. It's testing of people who are already on treatment to basically see if they've kept up with their treatment. And so it's an indication that there's less consistent monitoring and checkups, basically, of patients with HIV.
And obviously that's a very important distinction. And I understand you also reached out to the Department of Health about the data, and they're in the process of analyzing the data. So just how far back do you have knowledge of where the figures come from? Because there would have been a tracking of a period of time, I'd imagine.
Sure. So I've seen the data from showing testing figures from March and April of this year, and that's compared to the same months last year. And so it shows a drop in March and then a worse drop in April. In April, we see that testing among some groups, like pregnant women and infants, was down as much as 21%, which is pretty extreme. And I talked to a number of HIV experts in South Africa who all said that this did appear to be a clear result of the USAID cuts.
And just tell us about the facilities that would be involved in doing this testing. So were you looking at a particular district, province, or is it just across South Africa?
Across South Africa, and I started looking into this a couple of months ago because after the U.S. announced that it was suspending foreign aid, that was in late January, I started asking HIV experts in South Africa, what are some of the early signs that we might be able to see of a concrete impact of this? And so several people said that testing might be a good kind of early warning sign, because if testing drops, then it means that more people might not know that they have HIV, or they might not know that they're spreading HIV, and so that could lead to a rise in cases later. And so it's still fairly early to draw a lot of conclusions about the impact of the aid cuts, but this is a pretty strong early warning sign, I would say.
I mean, besides HIV/AIDS experts, you also spoke to community leaders. You mentioned Sophie Matse that you spoke to. So what was she able to report, particularly in light of the advocacy work that is being done by some NPOs who've lost out on funding? A lot of people have also been culled because of the aid cuts. So how do they absorb the current landscape given the aid cuts? Because it's not just the US, there are plenty of other countries who've cut ODA.
Right. I think it's really important to get that perspective from people who are in the communities and on the ground. And I would say my main takeaway from talking to people like Sophie is that there are a lot of reasons why patients don't want to go to public health centers. That's what a lot of people told me, is that patients who might have been going to NGO clinics before and now those clinics have shut down, they say that the public health centers are either far away, or they're too crowded, or the line is too long, or maybe they're not super welcoming to people with HIV. And so the government has said that, if people used to go to an NGO clinic, now they should go to a government clinic. And when I talked to people on the ground, they said basically that's not going to happen, and that's not happening.
And you mentioned obviously that the demographic that would be most affected would be women, would be adolescents, and would be babies as well. So the projection from your experts is that this means that we could see more deaths. Are they able to provide a linkage? I know you mentioned that it means we won't know how many people have HIV/AIDS, but if it's part of the prevention efforts that have been done before, if we could just trace that trajectory.
Yes, so it's especially important for mother-to-child transmission, because pregnant women who have HIV need to be tested even more regularly to see if their viral load is high or if the virus is suppressed, basically, so that they can know whether they might be likely to pass it on to the baby. And then infants who also might have been exposed to HIV need to be tested very early so that they can be diagnosed and put on treatment. And so essentially, if we're seeing a 20% drop in pregnant women, and that's viral load testing for pregnant women and infant diagnostic testing, then that could mean that more infants, for example, have HIV, but it might not be being diagnosed early. And for babies in particular, they need to be put on treatment early in order to survive.
And the PEPFAR funding for particularly HIV prevention and treatment in South Africa, what are the figures that initially were, and the operating budget that South Africa has to work with given the cuts?
Sure. So PEPFAR was providing about 17% of South Africa's HIV budget, which doesn't sound that big, but that 17% was actually pretty critical. It was funding more than 15,000 health workers. And so I think that the impact we're seeing now is mainly through a loss of staffing. Those were people who did HIV testing, but also counseling. These were health workers who worked in the communities, and if somebody missed an appointment or didn't pick up their treatment, these are people who would call them and remind them to come in and kind of talk to them about the importance of regular treatment. And so that's something that's been lost. The government, South Africa's government, does pay for all the medications itself. So there's no loss of HIV drugs.
So the broader political context, obviously, is from the MAG campaign or President Trump's America First campaign, this will continue to create an even bigger gap in terms of funding. The conversations that you're having with experts, the healthcare clinicians or even activists around HIV/AIDS, are they at least saying to you that there are ways in which this could be mitigated? Are there models that could be adopted?
Definitely ways that the government could take on some of the services that PEPFAR used to provide. For example, I think it would be hard. It's not easy to just transfer those services over immediately to the government when someone else was handling that before, and it would require funding. And so the government has told us that they are speaking with prospective donors. I think the future of the U.S. funding is still uncertain. We don't know if some of it might come back in the future, but in the meantime, the health ministry is looking for new funding. They did tell me, however, that the U.S. was such a large single donor that it'll be hard for any other donor to really fill that gap. So they might have to try to piece together funding from various other sources.
So obviously, as a journalist, there is a trail that you're following, especially around these funding cuts. Where do you think it's going to lead you to next?
I think there's a huge amount of follow-up reporting to be done. Like I said, this is just kind of an early indicator. I would love to, I definitely intend to keep following up on the impact of the aid cuts. I think that, unfortunately, we'll probably see more and worse impacts in the coming months unless something is kind of done urgently to replace some of these services that were lost. And so I think it's really important to keep an eye on that. I think there's more reporting that could be done on how it's affecting different communities in South Africa, why certain provinces are affected more than others. And then also, I'd like to look at the impact in neighboring countries, which if South Africa was depending on the U.S. for 17% of its HIV budget, some countries were much more dependent on U.S. aid. So we might be seeing, even worse impacts elsewhere.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Nelly. Much appreciated. Nelly Payton, Reuters journalist who has just written an article on how the withdrawal of financial aid from the U.S. in particular has led to a drop in HIV viral testing and how it's expected to have an impact, particularly on vulnerable communities, and lead to more deaths, according to experts.
At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Tshepiso Makwetla.
Channel Africa.
When the sun goes down, we don't stop the talk. Channel Africa, the best nighttime radio.
U.S. President Donald Trump has arrived in the Qatari capital, Doha, the second leg of his Middle Eastern trip after concluding his first visit to Saudi Arabia early on today. Qatar has been a key mediator in the Gaza conflict, and Trump's visit there is also being viewed as a critical moment towards achieving another yet elusive ceasefire in Gaza. The UN's top humanitarian official earlier urging the Security Council to take action to prevent a genocide in the enclave. President Trump's visit to the Emirate comes amid additional controversy after Qatar's royal family offered his administration a luxury $400 million Boeing Superjet as a donation that would upgrade the current presidential plane, Air Force One. Shimon Bryce Peace has more on this.
After receiving a lavish royal welcome by his hosts in Saudi Arabia, President Trump is now in the Qatari capital, where he's met with Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, where hundreds of dollars of investments in the United States are due to be announced. Qatar is also currently hosting renewed ceasefire for hostage talks, while Israel intensifies its military offensive in the decimated enclave, with reports that more than 70 people had been killed in just the last 24 hours, and where Israel stands accused of imposing inhumane conditions on civilians amid a more than 70-day humanitarian blockade. Listen to the UN humanitarian chief Tom Fletcher in the Security Council Tuesday.
The ICJ is considering whether a genocide is taking place in Gaza. It will weigh the testimony that we have shared, but it will be too late. Recognizing the urgency, the ICJ has indicated clear provisional measures that must be implemented now, yet they have not. So for those killed and those whose voices are silenced, what more evidence do you need now? Will you act decisively to prevent genocide and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law? Or will you say instead that we did all we could?
Trump's visit also stirring controversy at home over a proposed $400 million plane that the Qatari royal family wants to gift to the US president as a replacement for the current Air Force One, amid national security concerns, as Democratic Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer argued.
In light of the deeply troubling news of a possible Qatari-funded Air Force One and the reports that the Attorney General personally signed off on this clearly unethical deal, I am announcing a hold on all DOJ political nominees until we get more answers.
Trump has railed against the criticism, taking to social media in the early hours of the morning, arguing that the Boeing was being given as a gift to the Department of Defense and not to him personally, further questioning why taxpayers should be forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars when they could get an updated plane for free. This is what he told Fox News Channel's Hannity while traveling on Air Force One.
They said to me, we would like to make a gift. You've done so many things, and we'd like to make a gift to the Defense Department, which is where it's going. And I said, well, that's nice. Now, some people say, oh, you shouldn't accept gifts for the country. My attitude is, why wouldn't I accept a gift? We're giving to everybody else. Why wouldn't I accept a gift?
But a Washington, D.C.-based government ethics group says it is concerned. Noah Bookbinder is Executive Director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington.
The real danger here is that this other country, Qatar, has given him this appears that it is going to be giving him this very valuable gift, this huge luxury airplane. And that when he makes decisions, whether it's about the Middle East, which is a very volatile region, or about trade deals, that rather than making those decisions based on this analysis of what's in the American people's interest, that he's going to remember that they gave him this great plane that he loves, and that could tip him to make a different decision than he would make otherwise.
All this amid rampant speculation about possible peace talks between Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russia's President Vladimir Putin in Turkey on Thursday, which Trump said he might show up for, but without any confirmation as yet from the Kremlin on Putin's intentions. Orysia Lutsevich is with the Eurasia program at Chatham House.
What this bilateral meeting could look like, Russians could present their demands, Ukraine may reject these demands, and this will be the end of it. There could also be a high-level meeting between Ukrainian president, the president of Turkey, and maybe Donald Trump, if he decides to stop in Istanbul. And they could discuss wider issues, security in the Black Sea. They could discuss perhaps common position on pushing Russia to actually agree to stop the war and take a negotiation process in earnest and in good faith.
Amid rumblings that the US president is losing patience despite US efforts to end this war. Meanwhile, Trump's visit in Qatar and the region could also be catalytic towards a ceasefire in Gaza after a so-called goodwill gesture from Hamas earlier this week in the release of Israeli-American hostage Edan Alexander. Trump said in the Saudi capital Riyadh on Tuesday that more hostage releases would follow and that the people of Gaza deserved a better future, while Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to signal that there would be no end to the war until Hamas was completely defeated. I'm Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York.
And as we wrap up the program, let's tell you about the director of the Economic Development Department in South Africa of International Relations and Cooperation, Masotha Mnguni, who also serves as a G20 overall project coordinator, has emphasized that the country's presidency will be driven by voices of the people. Mnguni was speaking to Channel Africa on the sidelines of the launch of the G20 presidency community engagements and town hall outreach program held at the University of South Africa. Channel Africa's reporter Michael Mbewe was there.
South Africa's G20 presidency is taking a bold and inclusive turn as the country gears up to lead one of the world's most influential multilateral platforms. While South Africa has chosen solidarity, equality and sustainability as the central theme for the summit due in November 2025, questions have been asked to whether G20 is a platform for elites. Speaking to Channel Africa, G20 Summit Overall Project Coordinator Masotha Mnguni echoed the following.
We are happy to be on this platform so we may share with you and the listeners in terms of what informs our participation as the presidents of the G20 in this important meeting.
Mnguni underscores that the idea behind the town hall community engagements emanates from South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa's sentiments of inclusion during the launch of the G20 presidency.
Of course, our participation at this town hall meeting organized by UNISA is provided for by what President Ramaphosa indicated when he launched South Africa's G20 presidency in December 2024, when he said South Africa's presidency will be a people's G20, will be an inclusive G20. By inclusive, of course, we are talking about the inclusion of civil society, of academia, think tanks, grassroots organizations, the private sector, their inclusion in terms of contributing to the execution of the agenda we have put forward.
He says for G20 to be successful under its theme, it is imperative to extend an olive branch to broader stakeholders.
As you will recall that our chosen theme for South Africa's G20 presidency is solidarity, equality and sustainability. And of course, in order to do justice to that very ambitious agenda, you do need a whole of society involvement in terms of driving that important work, because the chosen priorities also talks to the aspirations of ordinary South Africans.
The South African ambassador to the United Nations, Nozipho Diseko, a former G20 Sherpa, factored in with the following comments on Africa's capabilities.
We need to understand Africa as a player globally very well. I am very proud of the capabilities diplomatically of the continent of Africa. On climate change, it is the best negotiators, the best, who understand the game.
And that brings us to the end of Africa World Hour this Wednesday evening it is. So let's find out what's coming up on Hotlines this evening. Shayla Ndikumala joins us. Shayla?
So we are going to be celebrating some unsung heroes. In the first hour, we look at the importance of mothers and building financial savvy families. I found that really interesting. So more often than not, we think Daddy Bear is going to be the one to teach you, show you the ropes around business. But we are seeing stats that are saying more women are contributing to the socialization of just financial institutions, how to carry your money, what to do with your money, when to start saving. These are conversations that have proven to be very fruitful when parents start having these with their young ones. And we're seeing that more mothers are doing that. And so that is going to be a focal point. Of course, we want to hear about your love stories. We're always keen for that. You can find us on WhatsApp to tell us more. And we'll continue celebrating some unsung heroes. All of this in the spirit of Africa Month. We want to churn out and exude as much excellence as possible on the show.
And just as a matter of curiosity, how old is the financial literacy education beginning? Is it becoming younger and younger?
Yes, we are seeing that conversations from as young as 6, where you sit down with your child and you explain to them. So, you know that chore concept, the reward concept,
Yes.
that some people contest against? That's proving to be something that kids perceive and sort of gauge the employment space as. I do something good, I get money. You see, so when you introduce concepts, not necessarily with the big financial terms, but as simple as if you do the right thing, you earn this. If you do the wrong thing, you don't earn at all, you know? And I think those are happening from age 6. Those are like critical moments when parents are starting to introduce these conversations. I do know that between 0 and 6 is like the fundamental growth point for a child. And so if you want to introduce ways of thinking, just the ways of thinking, not necessarily what to think of, but just the neural paths are developed between those years.
Well, let's find out just how young you were when you find out what real good financial planning was. That's Shayla Ndukumana with Hotlines coming up at 10, which is now.
Hotlines bring you fresh perspectives about love after dark. With Shayla Ndukumana. The conversations that define Africa's future. For brands, media planning, and advertisers, Channel Africa is more than just a platform. It's an opportunity. With 25 compelling shows covering current affairs, sports, business, music, and lifestyle, we deliver an engaging Pan-African audience ready to connect, invest, and act. Multi-award winning, internationally recognized, digitally accessible across the globe. When Africa speaks, the world listens, and Channel Africa makes sure of it. For business, for culture, for Africa, partner with Channel Africa because Africa's voice is the future. Africa is a story. A living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece. And for over 5 decades now, one voice has told it like no other. Channel Africa. More than just a broadcaster, Channel Africa is the pulse of the continent. African-led, African-run, and deeply rooted in its heritage. It's the only international station that speaks to Africa in its own voices. English, Kiswahili, Chinyanja, French, and Portuguese. The languages that unite 1 billion people. We have been there through every shift, every milestone, and every triumph. Not just reporting history, but shaping the conversations that define Africa's future. For brands, media planning, and advertisers, Channel Africa is more than just a platform. It's an opportunity. With 25 compelling shows covering current affairs, sports, business, music, and lifestyle, we deliver an engaging Pan-African audience ready to connect, invest, and act. Multi-award winning, internationally recognized, digitally accessible across the globe. When Africa speaks, the world listens, and Channel Africa makes sure of it. For business, for culture, for Africa, partner with Channel Africa because Africa's voice is the future. Africa is a story. A living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece. And for over 5 decades now, one voice has told it like no other. Channel Africa. More than just a broadcaster, Channel Africa is the pulse of the continent. African-led, African-run, and deeply rooted in its heritage. It's the only international station that speaks to Africa in its own voices. English, Kiswahili, Chinyanja, French, and Portuguese. The languages that unite 1 billion people. We have been there through every shift, every milestone, and every triumph. Not just reporting history, but shaping the conversations that define Africa's future. For brands, media planning, and advertisers, Channel Africa is more than just a platform. It's an opportunity. With 25 compelling shows covering current affairs, sports, business, music, and lifestyle, we deliver an engaging Pan-African audience ready to connect, invest, and act. Multi-award winning, internationally recognized, digitally accessible across the globe. When Africa speaks, the world listens, and Channel Africa makes sure of it. For business, for culture, for Africa, partner with Channel Africa, because Africa's voice is the future. Africa is a story, a living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece. And for over 5 decades now, one voice has told it like no other. Channel Africa. More than just a broadcaster, Channel Africa is the pulse of the continent, African-led, African-run, and deeply rooted in its heritage. It's the only international station that speaks to Africa in its own voices: English, Kiswahili, Chinyanja, French, and Portuguese. The languages that unite 1 billion people. We have been there through every shift, every milestone, and every triumph. Not just reporting history, but shaping the conversations that define Africa's future. For brands, media planning, and advertisers, Channel Africa is more than just a platform. It's an opportunity. With 25 compelling shows covering current affairs, sports, business, music, and lifestyle, we deliver an engaging Pan-African audience ready to connect, invest, and act. Multi-award winning, internationally recognized, digitally